Hi there, this is Lucy King. Before we start, I want to make a quick request to rate, follow, and subscribe to Making Contact wherever you're listening. Now, on to the show.
Making contact.
Making contact.
I'm Salima Hamarani, and welcome to Making Contact.
The official race for the White House, because we now do project that Donald Trump has been elected President of the United States.
The Fox News decision desk can now officially project that Donald Trump will become the 47th President of the United States.
President Donald Trump and Elon Musk together have already remade much of the U.S. government. But unfortunately, there's probably a lot more coming, and I know I'm already feeling overwhelmed.
Trump has just signed an executive order that will put in place an additional 10% tariff
reaction
on China.
Here in South Florida after President Donald Trump signed an executive order making English the official language of the United States.
The latest on the Trump administration's effort to reshape the government and downsize the federal workforce. Agencies are now facing a deadline to submit plans to restructure their operations.
But there is one area of the government that he hasn't turned his eye on quite yet. Confirmation fights for the Supreme Court were a huge part of Trump's first term. By the time he left office in 2021, he had stacked the court with a 6-3 split that put right-wing judges in power of the highest court of the nation. What does the return of Trump mean for the future of the Supreme Court and for the United States? Joining me to talk about the Supreme Court under Trump is Ellie Mystal. Ellie Mystal is a justice correspondent and columnist for The Nation magazine and host of their legal podcast, Contempt of Court. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. So, hi Ellie, welcome to today's show. I'm sorry to have you on to talk about such a disturbing topic.
The only thing to talk about right now is disturbing topics.
Yeah, I get the feeling the news will be full of disturbing topics for the next 4 years. Okay, so to start, Ellie, yes, Trump appointed some extremely conservative judges, but the Democrats, they could have done something in the last few years to help. What is it that they could have done?
It's not just that the Republicans appointed some conservative justices. They stacked the court with extremist Republicans using bad faith tactics, like the Merrick Garland appointment. The fact that he wasn't even able to get a meeting with Republicans, much less an up or down vote, was a constitutional crisis in real time while it was happening, right?
Okay, before we dive any deeper, let's talk about Merrick Garland. Back in 2016, after Justice Scalia passed away, there was a vacant seat on the Supreme Court, which was a seat that had been held by a conservative figure. At that time, Barack Obama was president, and he nominated Merrick Garland for the position. Now, Garland wasn't some left-wing radical. He was seen as a centrist, a judge even Republicans had liked. But then Mitch McConnell, who was at that time leading the Republican-controlled Senate, stepped in with a game-changing political maneuver. He proclaimed that Obama should not be allowed to make a Supreme Court nomination, at least not during an election year. So the Republicans basically ignored Garland's nomination completely, as if that Supreme Court seat wasn't even empty. That move, pretty much unprecedented in U.S. history.
I simply ask Republicans in the Senate to give him a fair hearing, and then an up or down vote. If you don't, then it will not only be an abdication of the Senate's constitutional duty, it will indicate a process for nominating and confirming judges that is beyond repair.
If Republicans had followed constitutional procedure and given that man an up or down vote, so many things would be different right now. So I never want to let Republicans off the hook for their dirty tricks to stack the court 6-3 in the favor of extremist conservative jurists. That said, for the Democrats to show up in 2021 with control of the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives and do nothing to reverse the bad faith, constitutionally questionable decisions of previous Republican administrations, that's political malpractice, that's legal malpractice. The number one job of the Biden administration was to fix the third branch of government so they couldn't do what they have in fact done. So what could the Democrats have done in real time? They could have packed the court. And that is an idea that has gotten a lot more traction, a lot more popularity over the past 4 years. But I was saying this in 2020, going into the election, that if you don't pack the court, if you don't add a number of liberal justices to counteract the extremist conservatives already on the court, all would be lost.
Okay, and what does that mean when people argue that the Democrats should have packed the court, which is an argument we hear a lot these days? What do they mean?
So the number of Supreme Court justices is not set by the Constitution. We started off with 6. Adams brought it down to 5. Jefferson put it back to 6, and then Jefferson put it to 7. Fast forward, Andrew Jackson put it to 9. Abraham Lincoln put it to 10. Then after Andrew Johnson, they rolled it back to 9, and it's been at 9 since the 1869 Judiciary Act, which is a law, which is a statute, not a constitutional principle. That number can be changed with a simple act of Congress passed in the House, passed by the Senate, signed by the president. You can have however many Supreme Court justices you want.
And most current arguments in favor of packing the court say that we should have 13 Supreme Court justices. Why? Because it mirrors the 13 circuit courts in the U.S.
It sounds reasonable to most people. Well, if we have 13 circuit courts, we should have 13 Supreme Court justices, right? That would have allowed Biden and the Democrats to add 4 justices to the Supreme Court. I've always thought that number was too small. My reform that I've been pushing since at least 2018 is to add 20 justices to the Supreme Court.
Whoa, wait, did you just say 20 judges? That's a lot.
Yeah, see, whenever I say that, people are just like, wow, that's a lot. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers California, Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, Arizona, a bunch of the other Western states, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has 29 judges on it. If you add 20 justices, that allows you to do a lot of reform to the Supreme Court beyond the partisan infighting, right? With a much larger court, what we do on the circuit courts, like in California for the Ninth Circuit, the judges hear cases in 3-judge panels. It's very rare that the whole circuit will hear a case sitting together, but all 29 of them will rule. Usually it's just a 3-judge panel. If you have 3-judge panels, that means you don't know which judges you're going to get when you file your case. In a functional democracy, is kind of important, right? You shouldn't get to pick your judges. If you had a 29-person court, you wouldn't know if your 3-judge panel was going to be 2-1 Republican or 2-1 Democrat or maybe 3-0 one party or another. Because you wouldn't know, your legal argument has to be much more center mass mainstream than the extremist that the Republicans do now. So that's one obvious reform benefit from adding more judges.
But maybe more importantly, adding more judges would make it really hard for any single party or extremist viewpoint to take over the entire court, which is clearly a huge issue at the moment.
If you add 20 judges, the power of the Supreme Court remains the same, but the power of each individual judge goes way down. You're one of 29 instead of just being one of 9. That means when you die or retire, that doesn't cause a constitutional crisis. It doesn't cause the law to change wildly one way or the other. Each death of an 80-year-old justice is not an inflection point in American politics, which is how it should be. So more judges decreases the power and importance of any one particular Supreme Court justice. 4 is more popular, and 4 would be a brute force partisan maneuver. But there are a lot of benefits to actually going bigger when it comes to the Supreme Court.
Okay, but we're not just talking about stacking the courts, because there is another big problem with the Supreme Court that the Democrats have remained very quiet about. And that is the pretty serious accusation of corruption.
Yeah.
Supreme Court Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito are disclosing trips they took that others paid for. They turned in their financial reports nearly 3 months later than the other 7 justices. Thomas is now acknowledging that he took 3 trips aboard a private plane owned by Republican donor Harlan Crow.
So, judges are taking money and gifts. And in another country, they would have been probably fired. They would have been stripped of all of their decision-making power. I mean, because it is the highest court in the entire country, right?
right? Corrupt judges in a functional democracy, people take that seriously. In our democracy, not so much. The obvious fix to the rampant corruption exposed by ProPublica and others about the current crop of Supreme Court justices is to apply an ethics bill to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the only court in the country that operates without a statutory ethics bill. If you go to traffic court in Peoria, Illinois, the judge there is under a statutory code of ethics. Not so if you go in front of the Supreme Court of the United States. That's bad. That is a bill that could be passed through Congress and signed by the president to impose real statutory ethics rules and, most importantly, real statutory ethics penalties for violating those rules. The Democrats didn't pass such a bill. Now, the Supreme Court argues that Congress can't impose an ethics requirement on the Supreme Court because of the separation of powers, that imposing penalties on Supreme Court justices would violate the constitutional separation of powers. I think that's a bad legal argument, but in our ridiculous system, the Supreme Court claims to have the final say on what is constitutional or not. So there is some question about whether the Supreme Court would even follow an ethics bill if Congress passed one. But here's the ace in the hole. Congress controls the budget. There's no constitutional question about that. So if I'm the Democrats in 2022 and I still have control of both chambers of Congress, the thing that I am doing is cutting their funding. You cut the budget of the Supreme Court until the Supreme Court agrees to play ball with actual ethics reforms. The Constitution says there shall be a Supreme Court. Doesn't say much else. Doesn't say they get a nice fancy building at First Street in Washington, D.C. Taxpayers paid for that. Congress authorized that. That building can be taken away. Congress has the budgetary power over the Supreme Court, and if the Supreme Court won't abide by basic ethical standards with real punishments for violations, Congress should cut their funding. But Democrats didn't want to do that.
And I mean, Ellie, just to drive this home, currently it is not illegal for the Supreme Court justices to take bribes.
Nope.
And then they can just make rulings. I mean, if I took bribes as a journalist, I would immediately lose my job. And I am not deciding, on the fundamental human rights of people in the United States, for example.
The Supreme Court will say, oh, but we, of course, don't take bribes. But if they did, there's nobody who can stop them. There's no constitutional means or statutory means to punish a Supreme Court justice for taking bribes. So to me, that's the real rub of it, right? And for the Supreme Court, there's no way to punish them. The only way to remove a Supreme Court justice under the Constitution is through the constitutional process of impeachment. An impeachment of the Supreme Court justice works just like the impeachment of the president. It has to be impeached in the House, the trial is in the Senate, and you need a supermajority in the Senate to remove a federal judge. And it's happened, I think, twice in history. Like it doesn't happen very often that you remove any federal judge, much less a Supreme Court judge. We could change that by statute.
Okay, and so that's where we are today. And so with the court as it stands, Trump, he's gotten busy signing executive order after executive order, many of which seem like they're illegal or unconstitutional. Are you worried about how the Supreme Court could help him pass those laws, even if they are unconstitutional? I mean, I guess I'm asking, can we rely on the courts right now?
It depends. Here's what I would say at 30,000 feet about the Supreme Court. The current Republican Supreme Court wants to do everything in its power to help Trump succeed as long as it doesn't make him look bad. They go out of their way to pretend that there's some constitutional, legal, statutory, presidential value in them so they can uphold what Trump is doing without spitting in the face of everything that's come before. Now, there are some executive orders that Trump has decreed that are so risible that I don't know that the Supreme Court will find a way around it. Birthright citizenship, for instance, is such an obvious what Trump is trying to do with that is rewrite the 14th Amendment via executive order. That's so beyond the pale that I don't know the Supreme Court will be able to make that one work. But here's the thing that I want people to focus on, right? One, Chief Justice John Roberts has a formula for helping Trump. And we saw that in Trump won his first term. We saw that with the Muslim ban. Trump will come to the Supreme Court with something ridiculous beyond the pale, out-of-pocket executive order. And the Supreme Court will say, well, no, that one's not good. But why don't you go back and work on it again, Mr. President, and come back to us? And they will give him the roadmap of how to fix it so that they can approve the executive order. And that's what they did with the Muslim ban. The Muslim ban that was affirmed in Trump v. Hawaii was the third Muslim ban, right? And so that's Roberts's way of getting Trump off the hook time and time again. It's to let him try and try until he gets it right. The second way they will rubber stamp the Trump administration is that you got to remember, for every one or two executive order they knock down, there are going to be 10 or 15 that they just don't even take a case on, right? And so people will get really focused on the one or two that they stop, but there's going to be all this stuff in the sewage that just passes through without Supreme Court comment, right? And so that's their other way of helping Trump. They fundamentally are going to legitimize 80, 90% of what he does, have a few big fights on a few big things, and even in those fights, they're going to be like, well, actually, you just need to try again.
And the Supreme Court, even if it wasn't entirely under Trump's bidding, can't actually enforce any laws on its own. And that's something to remember about the problem with checks and balances right now at the federal level. The idea of checks and balances as this highly lauded block against authoritarianism, it only works if, well, the party of authoritarianism hasn't taken over the government. I mean, I was really taken aback watching Elon Musk waltz into the Social Security office with just a few weak assurances about security. It's astounding to me that a private citizen could hold that much power. And it's made me think a lot about the so-called uniqueness of American institutions. This situation was not supposed to happen. But what if our institutions just aren't as unique as we'd like to believe? Stay tuned as we delve into the concept of American exceptionalism right after this break.
I'm jumping in to remind you that you are listening to Making Contact. If you like today's show and want more information, or if you'd like to leave us a comment, visit us at our new website, focmedia.org. There you can access today's show and all of our prior episodes. Okay, now back to the show.
Welcome back to Making Contact, and today we are talking about the Supreme Court under Trump, what's already happened with Trump's prior appointments, and what we can expect under the second administration. Joining us today is Ellie Mystal, the justice correspondent and columnist for The Nation magazine and host of their legal podcast, Contempt of Court. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. Ellie, you know, there's this very strong mythology in the United States about this idea of American exceptionalism, that we have very strong systems of checks and balances, that our institutions are especially robust and dependable. But I think that we're seeing under Trump that the idea of American exceptionalism is maybe an illusion.
Oh, yeah. This is the problem with the institutional argument, though. I've never been an institutionalist. I've never drunk the Kool-Aid on the exceptionalism of American institutions. Part of that is because I'm Black, and I know exactly how weak American institutions are in the face of inhumanity and genocide. The institutions only work if there are good people on both sides. What if one side isn't very good? And that absolutely includes the Supreme Court, which has been seated for a generation, right? This didn't just start with Trump. Republicans have been seating the Supreme Court with extremists for at least the past 50 years. This is the time of consequences of allowing those legal arsonists in nice clothes to get control of the third branch of government. Republicans have been on this game for 40, 50 years, and Democrats have been on the game of like, well, we just need good, strong institutional justices, not understanding that there was a whole revolution happening right under their noses, orchestrated by Republicans, orchestrated by the Federalist Society to turn the Supreme Court into what it has now become, which is an institution wholly incapable of holding Donald Trump and the executive accountable for anything.
Exactly. And so that inability to hold Trump accountable is what has me worried heading into the next 4 years. Because not only is the Supreme Court already stacked to the right and already supportive of Trump, but he may in fact this term appoint even more right-wing radical judges. Is that correct?
Right. So Donald Trump could be in position to be the first president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt to appoint a majority of the Supreme Court justices. Roosevelt needed 4 terms to pull that off. We are looking not just at a Republican majority, not just at an extremist conservative majority, but at a literal Trump majority if 2 Supreme Court justices retire or pass away over the next 4 years.
To be clear, the first replacements would probably be the older conservative judges, which would leave the court with much younger versions of the old guard extremists.
Now, Samuel Alito is the second oldest justice on the Supreme Court. He is 74. He is very likely to retire in the next 4 years. Alito is, for those who don't know, is the guy who wrote the Dobbs decision, stripping away the constitutional right to abortion, the first time in American history that a right once granted has been taken away. Alito is partisan to his core. Alito is a Republican first. Well, he's probably like a Republican first, a Phillies fan second, and a human third. He knows how old he is. He knows how much it would help Republicans to be able to replace him with a person 30 years younger than him. The other person that needs to go for Trump to be able to appoint a majority of the Supreme Court is most likely Clarence Thomas. He's the oldest current Supreme Court justice. He is 76. The thing about Thomas, though, is that Thomas loves his job. He loves taking away rights from Black people and women. It's like what gets him up in the morning, right? He likes his job. He's making a lot of money on the side. And there is something else he is going for. If Thomas makes it to 2028, he will become the longest serving Supreme Court justice in history. That's a mark. That's a legacy. That's a record, right? And it is believed that Thomas is very interested in breaking that record, right? However, there will be a lot of pressure on Thomas to retire. We don't know if he will be healthy for the next 4 years as well. And if those 2 people leave or get raptured, Trump will be able to appoint 1 or 2 new Supreme Court justices who will both be under 55, probably under 50, who can make that current 6-3 majority the Republicans enjoy relatively permanent, right? Certainly permanent for the rest of my natural life.
Yeah, and I mean, probably for the rest of my natural life too, which is sort of terrifying. So let's talk about a few of the possible replacements. For our listeners, you can head over to our website, focmedia.org, to read Ellie Mystal's article, which lists out a lot more possibilities and contenders, and they're stellar resumes. But Ellie, can you talk to me about the ones that you're most worried about?
Okay, I'll do those 2. The person most likely is a man named Andy Oldman. He's on the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals right now that meets out of Louisiana. He's from Texas, though. And he's basically Greg Abbott's, the governor of Texas, right-hand legal man. He organized the Texas resistance to the DACA program under Obama, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. He doesn't really believe that law should get in the way of his culture wars. Even when he writes, like his writings will be like culture war, amateur history. Oh, here's a statute in the footnote. We're done. He's a former Alito clerk, which means Alito could be replaced by one of his proteges. I think he is the most likely person to be picked should Alito retire. The most dangerous person is a man named James Ho, also currently on the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals. James Ho, he appears to really not understand the concept of full and equal rights for women. His reason for why, for instance, dentists should have standing to sue the makers of mifepristone, one of the 2 abortion pills, was that dentists are harmed when pregnant women terminate their pregnancies because they like looking at pregnant women.
Oh, wow. So he's that guy.
He was that guy. The one who basically said that women were manatees or something that must be observed in the wild, like Shamu, right? So he's the most dangerous. He's a former Clarence Thomas clerk who, when he got his appointment to the Fifth Circuit, was sworn in by Clarence Thomas in Harlan Crow's library. So he's the next guy on Crow's payroll, right?
Harlan Crow, by the way, is a big landowner. His father was the biggest landlord in the United States. Harlan Crow is also a major donor to conservative causes and the Republican Party. But the reason he's been in the news a lot is because of a series of investigations by ProPublica, which unearthed his decades-long relationship with Clarence Thomas.
There are new questions, ethics questions, surrounding Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. A report from ProPublica details more undisclosed financial ties to a Republican mega-donor.
That relationship included multiple gifts and vacations which were undisclosed. ProPublica argued that Harlan Crow is essentially, quote, subsidizing the lifestyle of Thomas and his wife.
The other name I'll just throw out there is Eileen Cannon, who many people know from her ability to keep Trump out of jail with her embarrassing handling of the documents case in Florida. Cannon does not have the qualifications to be a Supreme Court justice. She doesn't have the brightness we usually associate with Supreme Court justices, but she is loyal to Trump. And we know that Trump likes people whose entire careers are based on helping Trump, right? We know that he likes mediocrities who couldn't get a job other than licking Trump's boots, right? So I think in this world, that's her Supreme Court qualification. And quite frankly, of the names that I've said, I'll take her. I would rather have this mediocre person who has completely debased herself to Trump. I would rather have that than the kind of extremist, risible sexism and misogyny that comes out of James Ho, or the truly kind of antebellum white supremacy that comes out of Andy Oldman.
Okay, we're reaching the end of today's show, and I feel a little bit of personal responsibility not to leave our listeners in complete and utter despair, because we are getting a lot of despair in the news cycle these days. And Ellie, I feel like I just spent the last 30 minutes saying, sorry, but all of our institutions have failed. They've crumbled. Is there anything we can do?
Yeah, you're telling your audience the exact right thing. The institutions are broken and they're not coming back. We're going to have to do it ourselves. Nobody's coming. Gandalf is not showing up with the Rohirrim to get us out of our Helm's Deep. We have to fight our way out of this ourselves. And I keep coming back to the fact that Trump won a Democratic election for the first time. We did this to ourselves, and we are the only ones who can undo it. We have to fight. We have to protest. We have to divest from things. We have to boycott things. Every act of resistance is important. And hopefully we'll be allowed to have elections in the future where we can undo what we've done.
That was Ellie Mystal. He is the justice correspondent and columnist for The Nation magazine and host of their legal podcast, Contempt of Court. And that does it for today's show. If you'd like more information about Ellie Mystal, please visit us online at www.focmedia.org. I'm Salima Hamarani. Thanks for listening to Making Contact.